ماشي الحال. صباح الخير. Good morning. Welcome everyone. Thank you, Hani. It gives me great pleasure to welcome so many friends and colleagues to this conference on post-Eurocentric poetics, new approaches from Arabic, Turkish, and Persian literature at my home institution, the American University of Beirut. The conference is organized by Hani Rashwan and Abdurrahim Abu Hussein. I get excited every time I utter Abdurrahim Abu Hussein and Hani. So, I'm the chairperson of the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages here at AUB, the department that teaches all languages included in the title of this conference and much more. I would have liked to see Hebrew and Syriac and others in the title, but it's a very good start. We are in the eye of the storm here at AUB, as the Middle East is being rethought, painfully rethought sometimes. We need to rethink Middle Eastern studies, and we are. Just in the last 3 weeks here at AUB, AUB convened an international conference to rethink Islamic studies, towards rethinking of Islamic studies. We organized a conference on the novelist Ilyas Khouri, a history conference and exhibit on the Ottoman Holy Rail to the Hijaz, and a conference on Latin America, Al-Andalus, and the Arab world, and another conference on Mamluk studies, and another Mamluk cities, and another on Arabic anthologies in the pre-modern era. So many conferences. Not to mention the lectures, of course, and the other events and workshops. 2018, in fact, started with a conference entitled Feminism in Crisis, which brought together academics and activists in a dialogue on the current state of feminist research in the region. The AUB campus is host to a large number of workshops and lectures, artists in residence, activities centering on the Middle East, inviting international perspectives, but grounding the conversation in a local one. And I would like to stress this last phrase, in a local one. I'm a scholar of Arabic and Islamic studies, and I studied and worked in the US. And I chose to return to my alma mater, AUB. I'm often asked about the reasons behind my return to AUB, and I must confess that one of the main reasons is that I'm tired of being relevant or trying to be relevant. I'm tired of faking it. Some of you may know that I have spent a good part of my career working on an Abbasid anthologist, an important adib, critic, and historian of literature who left dozens of books, if not hundreds, but is hardly known in comparative literature circles, and even less known to many people outside the Arab literary circles. I'm talking about Abu Mansur al-Tha'alibi. Why is Tha'alibi unknown? Simply, Tha'alibi did not write fiction or composed wine poetry. In a sense, he's not the liberal type or the liberal image, or even love poetry, imagine. Not even Mujun. He did not ascend to the sky or descend to the underground, i.e., he does not remind us of European works. I have delivered dozens of lectures in American universities, but never was I asked to talk on Tha'alibi or about Tha'alibi. Never. Later, I started to write on Sufi poetry and poetics, trying to be relevant, right? And my colleagues often assume that I write on Rumi, or that I should write on Rumi. Somehow I'm missing a great figure. And thus my work is irrelevant. Well, Rumi at the end of the day is the most read poet in the USA, so this is more or less understandable. Even later, when I started to work on the Maqamat of Hamadani, one of the most important works of Middle Eastern literature, I claim, I was often invited to talk about the Maqamat simply because they have a connection with European picaresque tales, the Don Quixote, right? Or because they are works of fiction. Well, let me say it frankly, Maqamat are very bad works of fiction. The interplay between prose and poetry, the flowery language, the dark humor, the literary and poetic debates, the interchange between language and the various fields of knowledge in the maqamat were of absolutely no interest to my audience. Even when I taught in the USA, my department repeatedly asked me to teach the Arabian Nights, right? This is what brings students. This is how we represent Arabic literature. Well, it's mostly French literature, to be honest. Or to include in my Arabic literature in translation course genres and works that directly relate to European literature or taste, or evoke the famous questions of authorship and performance and the like. Everything has to relate to these. Ma'ari was important to my department because it evokes Dante. It evokes someone later. Majnun Layla calls Romeo and Juliet, and etc. Arabic literature is important, very important, as long as it reminds us of something European, i.e., as long as it's not only Arabic literature. I say this to remind myself first that we need, from our location here at the heart of the Arab region, to study and research the region from the unique vantage point provided by our location and by our intimate knowledge of the region, to set our own questions. You can imagine how happy I was when my colleague Hani Rashwan suggested the topic of this conference. I'm personally excited about all words that appear in the title: post-Eurocentric, poetics, new approaches, Arabic, Turkish, Persian literature. So, and imagine how excited I am to see all these words combined in one title. The conference engages with a range of approaches in Arabic, Turkish, and Persian cultures that are overlooked or misunderstood under a long-established Eurocentric hegemony. It encourages scholars to reconstruct the concepts of artistic or poetic language by engaging with literary concepts that have been marginalized due to their distance from the European literary tradition. We hope that this conference will move us in the right direction and in asking the right questions, the relevant questions, and that it increase possibilities for future collaborations between our institutions. I wholeheartedly thank Hani Rashwan and Abdurrahim Abu Hussein for putting together this beautiful conference. I would like to end by welcoming you again. I'm personally thrilled to have you with us today. Enjoy your stay, enjoy Lebanon, and ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you so much, Professor Bilal Al-Khalid, for this warm welcoming. We are really happy to have you here in AUB, and thank you for lots of people coming from America and coming like 6 hours charter from Istanbul. So we are really happy that you could make it. And we have to thank also Professor Abdurrahim. He's one of the hidden soldiers behind this conference. Without his full support, we wouldn't be here now today. And also to thank Rita Basir and Rania Salha for their great effort. I'm sure you have touched that in your communication with them. So it was really hectic. As Professor Bilal said, we had like three conferences, and they were very interesting events. And we conclude with this one during Ramadan and during the exam times as well. So, but I think we are enough to each other, so it's a very good company. So welcome everyone, and now we welcome Professor Rebecca Gold to give us the keynote speech. Please welcome Professor Rebecca.
Great. Yeah, you could let me know if we'll see if I go close to over. Great. So it's so exciting to be here. I think that the title, when we decided I would give a slightly broader presentation, the title also has broadened out a little bit, but I will be sticking to the announced topic as well. So I'm very excited to be here, and particularly as it intersects with, very closely with a project that I'm embarking on as of a couple of weeks ago called Global Literary Theory. I should move back to the There we go. Yes. This 5-year project specifically focused on the topic of this conference, Balakha. And Hani's also going to be part of that project, and I'll be talking about that in a second. So I thought I would, so it frames a lot of what will be happening, and in a sense it gives, this project gives an infrastructure for continuing the conversation over the course of the next 5 years. Hopefully I'll see some of you in Birmingham or at other cities where we will be convening and discussing these topics. Because I think all of us know sort of the gargantuan nature of this endeavor. So I thought I would talk for about 5 minutes just from a sort of summary of the project overall, a rationale for it, and then go into a case study from literary theory. And I should mention that this is, I think it maybe makes a nice counterpart with the Professor Orfali's speech, because it is actually direct, it's focused on the comparative literature world, so in a sense people who need to be persuaded, and luckily not everyone does need to be persuaded of the importance of this subject, but unfortunately a lot of people still do, and so I navigate between those two audiences in this talk. So there's a sort of a general reflection on Eurocentrism, and as well as a case study. So global literary theory, the full name of the project is Global Literary Theory, Caucasus Literatures in a Comparative Context, but it's very broadly beyond the Caucasus as well. It responds to the absence within contemporary literary studies of a paradigm for studying non-European literatures. We develop a method for engaging with Islamic, and I'll just give you, there's a structure of what I'll be talking about, for engaging with Islamic and other world literatures by offering 4 case studies of rhetorical traditions from the multilingual Caucasus, or traditions that intersected in the Caucasus, although they spanned much more broadly throughout the entire Islamic world as well. And the sort of rationale behind the project, this picture I think summarizes that well. And it also recapitulates some of what was been said a few minutes ago. As practiced today, world literature lacks a method. It is deficient as regards its geographic scope, its conception of literature. I think that's really the key point, and the tools it has developed for engaging in literary comparison. In part due to its verbal medium, and because I think it's interesting for me to reflect on why other disciplines seem to have don't have such difficulties with moving beyond Eurocentrism. Literature, there's a specific issue with literary studies, I think. So the verbal medium tends towards specificity rather than systematicity. Hence, comparative literature lags behind the social sciences and history when it comes to taking a truly global approach to its object of inquiry. And I think that point is actually borne out in the example that you just gave of the Majnun Layla, Al-Ma'ari, and then Dante, that we just think of comparing text to text rather than actually how literature is conceived in one tradition to how literature is conceived in another, when that is really what we should be doing. Frequently, texts from non-European literatures are inserted in an ad hoc fashion into existing literary canons, with the idea that such substitutions of themselves globalize the study of literature. That is, some might say, what world literature is. However, thank you, yeah. However, it seems to skip by itself, yeah. These attempts at globalizing literary canons have failed to globalize the discipline. The effects have been superficial, leaving contemporary literary studies dependent on paradigms that were historically developed to understand European literatures. So the reader, the text, all of those ideas, right? As I think we're all extremely familiar with this. Constrained by this as well. So the core problem is not specific missing text, but rather the absence of a method. Global Lit, which will offer a new perspective on what literature is, why it matters, and how it engages with the world it represents. And as we know, there is a deep tradition of reflection within these poetics on addressing these questions. Even the most basic questions concerning the nature of literary representation have as yet been explored primarily through European aesthetic traditions. Global literary theory contributes to an ongoing paradigm shift within comparative literature. Beyond introducing new text into the equation, we introduce a discipline that is new to contemporary literary studies, yet deeply rooted in Islamic thought, Ilm al-Balagha. The project consists of 4 case studies of classical rhetorical traditions in Arabic, Persian, Turkic, and Georgian. Among the many paradigm shifts enabled by these traditions is a new understanding of the relationship between poetic and sacred discourse. The rhetorical discipline on which Global Lit is focused was developed by Muslim scholars who wanted to prove in literary terms the aesthetic superiority of the Quran. The tools that these scholars developed to debate the aesthetic stakes of sacred discourse can help literary theorists today demonstrate the importance of the literary imagination to everyday politics. The overlapping strands of the project examine how key terms relating to the theory of literature, such as representation, metaphor, and meaning, were rendered into Persian, Turkic, and other vernacular literatures of the Caucasus and neighboring regions. The project will culminate by asking how Islamic rhetorical theory, or maybe we could call it poetics instead, that's something to discuss, resonated outside the Islamic world, and by considering how these theoretical traditions can shape literary discourse in the post-secular and post-colonial present. In developing a hermeneutics for sacred language, Muslim scholars made major contributions to our understanding of poetry's place in the world, to its modes of representation, and to the internal relationship between form and literary meaning. Each of these matters have been issues of abiding concern within literary studies, yet we lack a method for bringing these themes together into a system. The discipline of balagha offers a way forward for many areas of inquiry, ranging from comparative aesthetics to the philosophy of language, and of course, comparative literature. The paradigm developed in this first systematic study of multilingual Islamic rhetoric lays the groundwork for a truly global world literary theory. So that's a sort of general overview of what the project, try to keep close. Can you hear me? It's better when I speak with the microphone. A paradigm of what the project is doing, its place within, say, contemporary Anglophone, European-oriented literary studies in the UK and Europe and the US, trying to move beyond what world literature is doing at present. And I think another sort of prelude or self-critical reflection that should take place while embarking on a project like this, and the project we're embarked on, as well as really thinking very critically about Eurocentrism as a lens of critique. And again, I'm mindful of the multiple audiences that we address. There is a question to be asked here of, I think we need to also be aware that this isn't just about extending a canon. We don't just want to do sort of a more elevated version of world literature all over again. And there is, I think, an important sense in which theory and theoretical reflection shouldn't be confined to any geography. It shouldn't be reducible to that. So then there is a sense in which merely to criticize a discipline for being Eurocentric isn't quite enough, right? We need actually some sense of what we do better, what are the traditions we're building on, do better and differently. So it's not just a kind of empirical exercise. And then, of course, the problem is just that the very terms that we have for the meaning of literature, all of those words are constraining and confining. Yes, and so I think also there needs to be translation studies is an important discipline within which this type of endeavor can be situated, because it requires a sort of belief in the translatability of literary form, of poetics across languages. I really think on both. I mean, the problem of Eurocentrism is it's not just one. It's not just Europe. It's also a failure to translate the relevance of these archives and literatures into a language that matters to all of us today and to anyone who cares about literature. There, okay, great. And so yes, the framework is ilm al-balagha, which I think, tentatively we can translate that as poetics. Those are some of the core questions asked by the project. Oh, there we go. And the three different strands, you can recognize that picture there. Hanir Weshran is the Arabic postdoc for Birmingham. He's joining in a few months. And then we're also hiring postdocs in Persian and Turkic who will focus on the intersections of balagha text in their respective traditions and really try to find a language for thinking about the conceptual transformations in metaphor, authorship, understandings of the text and of reading, and the sort of core, I think at least, when I'd love to have conversations about this, about how do we actually achieve this? I mean, I outlined some incredibly ambitious goals, but what are the mechanics, right, of bringing about this disciplinary transformation? And my perspective is that an anthology of these texts is needed, and not just an anthology that obviously translates the text, and I know there was just a conference here on anthologies, but is there a problem with, oh, you like the picture?
I like dumplings, but
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, but that would be something be great to talk about and think about maybe in the roundtable session. What exactly what criterion would that anthology need to answer to? What would it need to look like? What would be the standards? What would make it work? Rather than just being a sort of one more drop in the bucket. Right. So that's the empirical agenda. And we'll be talking, obviously, today in a lot more detail about the different meanings of rhetoric. I've talked already with Hani about this. Hitaba, is it, or the relationship between oral rhetoric and textual rhetoric. I would say here I am focused, and I could be persuaded otherwise, but I do think there is something very specific about sort of written rhetoric that it does make sense to kind of limit ourselves in that way in terms of thinking, but maybe, I could be persuaded, but that there's something interesting just about the way the text is theorized. So I was thinking perhaps we could even call it textualized poetics or textualized rhetoric. And obviously, this is all going to be extremely obvious to those of you in this audience, but what the uniqueness of this archive, this discipline, is. The Quranic hermeneutics obviously changes. It makes it somehow qualitatively, literary theory, qualitatively different from the counterparts in Europe. And I really want to think through why would that be relevant, say to scholars who aren't Quranic scholars or not even Muslims? Like, what is the importance of that? Obviously, it does, I think there is a different understanding of the relevance of literature and of the relevance of close reading and these kinds of processes which have a sacred dimension in Islamic culture. There's a question to be asked, does it make sense to talk about Islamic literary theory? I'm kind of tempted to think it does as a kind of something to describe what links Arabic, Persian, Turkic, and other literatures of that world. But again, I could be persuaded otherwise. And so I'll just walk you through one example of how I see potentially, and again, it's obviously a long process, but potentially one series of say, how one can follow one specific question through a series of Persian texts, and then generalize from that trajectory and say, well, this is actually something that can change the way that we think about literature and literary theory today. And so in Persian literary theory, and how am I, halfway through for time, or? Okay. In Persian, there's a sort of triumvirate of core Balagha text, Raduyani, Rashiduddin Vatvat, and Shamsi Qais, who are each foundational in their own way. It's kind of interesting to me that these figures have not really, certainly in European scholarship, they've been considered in isolation from each other. There hasn't been much in the way of a kind of systematic analysis of how these three texts relate to each other, even though they're obviously in very deep conversation with each other, and they're dealing with the same questions, and it's completely, it would be a very logical thing to bring them together in systematic fashion. And I won't say that I've studied all of them. I won't say that I've done that yet. But if one just looks at sort of how questions of translation and literary appropriation, sarika, transpire across these three texts, I think some interesting things are revealed. So the Raduyani text, that's probably the least known, Tarjuman al-Balagha, one could translate that as interpreter of rhetoric, the translator of rhetoric. It was least known because it was only recently, the manuscript was only recently uncovered in Istanbul, I believe, by a Turkish scholar whose name I don't remember. But it was known in Persian literary thought. But the manuscript was lost, and a unique copy was discovered in the 50s. And also the authorship, it was misattributed. It was attributed to the poet Farukhi. Now we know he was not the author of the text. This is composed in Central Asia. It appears to be the first Persian language attempt to render books like Kitab al-Badi of Ibn al-Mutaz into Persian. And it's interesting. I admire the text tremendously. It seems to me, in some ways, a very bold text, but also in some ways, again, taking a step back, I can't say that it is a text that had much of it impact. I mean, there's something also deeply wrong with it. I mean, and by wrong, I just mean from a kind of normative literary theory perspective. And that is that it goes so far to sort of remove, it removes anything Arabic from its content. It's a remarkably Persianate text for something written in that milieu when there was still almost all scholarly literature was in Arabic. He changes, like the Bismillah, he gives that in Persian, which is not typical of the Persian of the time. I mean, there's Ferdowsi, but that's for poetry. For a scholarly text to be that heavily Persianized there's kind of something, he's pursuing some kind of linguistic purity that arguably distances himself from the Arabic tradition that he is clearly in very, very deep dialogue with. So then I would say it's very idiosyncratic and it's definitely worth engaging. I think it's been unjustly neglected. But you could say that agenda might explain why it actually had very little impact on Persian literary theory. The impact that it had was kind of under the surface. In other words, it was read by scholars, but they rarely cited it. They rarely referenced it. It doesn't have a kind of authority or prestige. So as a translation, you could see it as a text that is so concerned with purity kind of a mechanical purification of Persian that it doesn't theoretically generate new meanings for the audience. And then the next, and of course obviously there's a lot more nuances and details to be said about each specific text. Okay, how is that the same or?
You just can stand.
What's happening?
Yeah, it will connect with your
Okay.
You don't have to do that.
Okay, tell me if I'm not audible. So Vatvat, Sihr al-Halal, Magic Gardens, and the Nuance of Poetry, each of these texts are spaced about a century apart. And here's a text where clearly the author was deeply familiar with Raduyani, but he doesn't reference him. He has no authority. He doesn't rely on him in an open and explicit way. And it's interesting in the sense that this is it's basically a bilingual text. I mean, the text is in Persian, but a lot of his examples are in Arabic. He just includes these sort of large quotes from Arabic without trying to really make sense of them or incorporate them in any conceptual way into a Persianate literary understanding. So instead of trying to, there's no attempt to adapt, to engage, although there's a lot of original thinking in Persian as well. But it's an interesting kind of halfway point between in this trajectory of these three texts. And it did have some influence. In some ways, you would see it as a kind of necessary precursor to the third, much more famous work of literary theory that is really canonical now in Persian and kind of, in a sense, overshadows the other two to such a great extent. The other two almost don't exist side by side with this, the Mujam, which is, it is kind of the gold standard for balagha in Persian. And some of you will be familiar with the famous story with which Shamsuddin's prefaces his text, where he says it was originally composed in Arabic, and then that manuscript was destroyed by the Mongols, and he rewrote it in Persian. And some people have said, well, it seems like that may have been just kind of an excuse for some reasons, or there's something strategic about the way in which he justifies the fact that he's writing it in Persian. That's, it shouldn't just be taken at face value. But what's interesting about this text is that it goes much farther than the other two in terms of actually conceptualizing the Arabic tradition for a Persian audience. It doesn't just offer this kind of versification in a linguistic sense as Raduyani does, nor does it just give you paragraphs of Arabic without any attempt at assimilation. It actually tries something, you could say, significantly more creative. But what I think is perhaps the most interesting thing is to connect that trajectory. So the trajectory I just laid out from, and again, this is definitely a selective history. There's no question about that. But the trajectory from Raduyani to Vatvat to Shamsuddin's, I actually see that reproduced in the very typology of, how do we want to call it, literary appropriation, or sarika, that's the term there that I have in mind, that is offered by Shamsi Kays. So this is one of his great contributions, I would say, to literary theory and to thinking about authorship and originality and the relationship between the text and the reader, what actually creativity is, basically, there's a very important reflection here that I do think we would all benefit, we as in, not just in this room, but the discipline of comparative literature would benefit from taking more seriously. And as I said, I think I see it also reciprocated in the trajectory of Persian literary theory itself. So he offers a typology, so sarika, I should mention, it's normally translated as plagiarism, frequently by, say, Grunewald and a lot of Orientalists. And I think that makes sense in certain contexts. Literary theft, it comes from the root for theft. So plagiarism makes sense, and there are definitely uses, examples of sarika that merit that kind of pejorative connotation. Such as, well, his example, Shamsi Kays, is passing off another person's poetry as one's own. So that's dishonesty. It's also bad literary artistry. It is plagiarism in the kind of obvious dictionary sense that we use it today. But he has there's a trajectory here, 4 different kinds. So poems that, the red font is for sort of the verb that most clearly characterizes this type of sarika. Poems that reuse old meanings and wordings in new verses. So the reuse of an old form or in a new verse is it's sort of in between being derivative and being creative. It's on the path towards improvement. The next best one is to use another poet's mental content, so the ma'na, in a different form and aspect. That is actually admirable. But he does consider that sarika. He does consider that a kind of, in a formal sense, it's derivative, right? It's not original, but it's a admirable kind of use. And by far the best is a translation that surpasses the verse the poet was imitating. So if you completely transform the source text and surpass it, that is, in a sense, what should be the goal of every poet. But that is also sarika, it's also imitation. So it never loses, there's never a sense of not being indebted to your predecessor. I mean, I would sharply juxtapose this to, say, Harold Bloom understanding of influence, right? It's always admirable, just that in what way you copy your predecessor determines the quality of the final product. Right, so I think I've summarized the points there. There's a trajectory from a kind of mechanical translation, wherein it's just very much about sort of wholesale Persianization, but without really theorizing. I guess you could say without focusing on the ma'na of the original, right? Without reconceptualizing that or carrying it over into the new medium. And translation obviously is meant here in very, very general terms. To a creative synthesis that creatively appropriates the original and produces something new, surpassing it. So that's the case study I wanted to offer. And as I said, I think there is contained in that trajectory, that fourfold typology of literary appropriation, there is a sense as well of the reader having a tremendous agency in the reading process. The reader being a figure who, in a sense, a poet, a reader who reads well and who understands, who absorbs the original, is already a poet. That's the creative process. And that is somewhat different. It's obviously different from, say, the romantic model of the unique imagination, right, of the gifted poet who can't be compared to the reader. So that's the key points I wanted to summarize. Okay, I have a few minutes left. Yeah, just the translation is the perfection of the process, a way of reading closely. I think that's those are the main points that I wanted to summarize. That there is obviously that's just skimming the surface of what can be offered. But I see that is one specific example from Persian literary theory, where looking at the way that readership is theorized, the way that imitation is actually the beginning of originality. That in fact there's no concept of being obviously it's very much in contrast to a lot of modern aesthetic modernism, right? There is no way of being original except by engaging with the past. Thank you very much.